Faso, who had come as part of Oxford's African Leadership Series. Traore sat quietly in the front row, wearing a simple dark suit. He listened carefully and took notes while others spoke about development, democracy, and international cooperation. At 3:30 p.m., Professor Edmund Harrington took the stage. He was in his late 60s with silver hair and wire-framed glasses. He was well known and respected, having written many books on European history and civilization. His introduction praised him highly. Rhodes Scholar, author of 12 books, and the holder of 3 honorary doctorates. As he began his lecture on the foundations of modern civilization, his tone was confident, almost dismissive, as if the conclusions he was about to present were beyond dispute. When we examine the pillars of human advancement, Harrington began, his voice echoing through the historic venue, we see a clear pattern: mathematics from Greece, law from Rome, philosophy from Germany, industrial innovation from Britain. He paused, surveying the audience over his glasses. The foundations of what we call civilization have decidedly Western origins. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably, but Harrington continued, emboldened by the academic setting that had long protected such views. 20 minutes into his lecture, Harrington made the statement that would define the rest of his life. Now, some might ask about other continents' contributions. Asia gave us gunpowder and paper, certainly. The Americas had sophisticated calendars. But Africa? He paused dramatically, a slight smirk playing on his lips. I challenge anyone in this room to name a single significant contribution to human civilization from sub-Saharan Africa. The continent has been a recipient of civilization, not a contributor to it. The silence that followed was deafening. In the front row, Ibrahim Traore slowly closed his notebook. He placed his pen carefully on the desk beside it. Around him, several African students and academics sat frozen, caught between outrage and the intimidating atmosphere of challenging such a senior professor in Oxford's most prestigious venue. The moment stretched on, heavy with unspoken tension, until Traore raised his hand. Yes? Harrington acknowledged him with barely concealed irritation, clearly not expecting to be challenged. Traore stood, his movement deliberate and calm. Professor Harrington, he began, his voice carrying despite not using the microphone, I would like to respond to your assertion, if I may. Harrington's smirk widened. By all means, Mr. He pretended not to know who Traore was, though the president had been introduced at the beginning of the event. Traore, Ibrahim Traore, he replied simply, not mentioning his title. And I accept your challenge. A ripple of anticipation ran through the audience. Several people began discreetly recording on their phones, sensing something significant was about to unfold. Harrington gestured dismissively toward the stage. Please enlighten us, but do try to stick to historical facts rather than romantic nationalism. The condescension in his voice was palpable. Traore walked to the podium with measured steps. He carried with him a simple leather folder, which he placed carefully on the lectern. For a moment he stood silently, looking out at the audience, then directly at Harrington. Professor, he began, before I address your challenge, may I ask you a question? In your extensive research, have you ever visited the manuscript collections in Timbuktu? Have you studied the mathematical treatises of the Dune people? Have you examined the metallurgical techniques of the Haya people of Tanzania? Harrington waved his hand dismissively. Ancient mud buildings and primitive folklore hardly constitute civilization, Mr. Traore. We're talking about contributions to human advancement, not anthropological curiosities. Several gasps could be heard from the audience at the blatant disrespect, but Traore remained calm. He opened his folder and pulled out a single document. Then let us begin with something you might recognize, he said, holding up a photocopy of an ancient text. This is a page from the Lebombo bone, discovered in Swaziland. It's 44,000 years old, Professor. It contains the earliest known mathematical calculations in human history. 29 distinct notches marking lunar cycles. Mathematics didn't begin in Greece, Professor. It began in Africa. The smirk began to fade from Harrington's face, but he quickly recovered. Counting notches is hardly Pythagoras, he scoffed. Traore pulled out another document. Then perhaps we should discuss the Ishango bone from the Democratic Republic of Congo, 20,000 years old, containing evidence of prime numbers, multiplication, and division. This predates Greek mathematics by nearly 19,000 years. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. But you want more recent examples? Very well. Let's discuss the University of Sankore in Timbuktu, which housed 700,000 manuscripts and educated 25,000 students in the 12th century, when Oxford was still a collection of drinking halls. The audience was now completely silent, hanging on every word. Traore continued, his voice gaining strength but never losing its calm dignity. You mentioned law coming from Rome. Shall we discuss the constitution of the Ashanti Confederacy, which included checks and balances 3 centuries before the American Constitution, or the Buganda Parliament, which had a complex system of democratic governance while Europe was still ruled by absolute monarchs? You speak of philosophy from Germany, Traore continued, now fully in his element. Have you read the philosophical texts of Zara Yacob, the 17th century Ethiopian philosopher who developed ideas about rational inquiry and human rights that preceded the European Enlightenment? His student, Walda Haywat, wrote treatises on ethics that rival anything produced in Europe at the time. But of course, they wrote in Ge'ez, not Latin, so perhaps they don't count in your estimation. Harrington tried to interject. These are isolated examples. But Traore held up his hand, and surprisingly, the professor fell silent. Isolated, Professor? Let me tell you about isolation. It's when the Library of Alexandria, founded by an African dynasty, housed the world's knowledge while the ancestors of Oxford's founders were still living in mud huts. It's when African mathematicians were calculating the circumference of the Earth, while Europeans believed it was flat. You want contributions to civilization? Traore's voice rose slightly for the first time. Let's talk about medicine. The first successful cataract surgery was performed in Mali in the 14th century. The first cesarean section, where both mother and child survived, was performed in Uganda in 1879, using techniques that wouldn't appear in European medicine for another 50 years. The first vaccination, not Edward Jenner's cowpox method, but variolation against smallpox, was practiced in West Africa and brought to America by enslaved Africans. He pulled out another paper. Architecture. The Great Zimbabwe's acoustic properties surpass modern engineering. The Nubian pyramids predate their Egyptian counterparts. The rock churches of Lalibela were carved from single pieces of volcanic rock with a precision that modern engineers struggle to explain. But perhaps you've never heard of these, because they don't fit your narrative of African primitiveness. The transformation in the room was palpable. Students who had been slouching were now sitting upright, many taking notes. Several professors were nodding along, some looking uncomfortable, others seemingly discovering this information for the first time. Harrington's face had gone from dismissive to defensive, to something approaching panic. But Traore wasn't finished. Let's discuss metallurgy, he continued, his voice now carrying the authority of absolute certainty. The Haya people of Tanzania were producing carbon steel in blast furnaces 2,000 years ago, a technique that wouldn't appear in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. The bronzes of Benin are so sophisticated that, when Europeans first saw them, they refused to believe Africans could have made them. So they invented theories about lost Portuguese craftsmen. Agriculture. Africans domesticated pearl millet, sorghum, African rice, yam, black-eyed peas, watermelon, and okra. They developed complex irrigation systems in the Sahel that sustained cities of hundreds of thousands, while Europe was experiencing the Dark Ages. The terraced agriculture of the Dune people has sustained communities for over 1,000 years in conditions where European farming methods fail within a season. Traore paused, looking directly at Harrington, who was now visibly sweating despite the cool temperature of the theater. But perhaps most importantly, Professor, let's talk about Ubuntu, the philosophical concept that I am because we are. While European philosophy was obsessing over individual rights and conquest, African philosophy was developing concepts of restorative justice, collective responsibility, and human dignity. Concepts the so-called civilized world is only now beginning to understand. The tragedy, Professor Harrington, Traore said, his voice now soft but piercing, is not that Africa contributed nothing to civilization. The tragedy is that scholars like you have spent centuries actively erasing, ignoring, and denigrating those contributions. When the library of Timbuktu was at its height, housing more books than any European university, your ancestors called us illiterate. When our astronomers were tracking the movements of the stars, you called us superstitious. When our healers were performing complex surgeries, you called us witch doctors. He picked up his folder and pulled out one final document. This, Professor, is a letter from Cecil Rhodes, founder of the scholarship that perhaps funded your education. In it, he explicitly states that African history must be suppressed to justify colonization. Your ignorance isn't accidental, Professor. It's the result of a deliberate, systematic effort to erase African contributions to human civilization, and you've been perpetuating it for 47 years. The silence in the theater was absolute. Harrington stood at the side of the stage, his mouth opening and closing, but no words emerged. Traore wasn't quite finished. I could continue for hours, Professor. I could tell you about the astronomical calculations of the Dune people, who knew about Sirius B centuries before Western telescopes could detect it. I could describe the complex fractal geometry in African art that predates Mandelbrot by centuries. I could explain how the call and response tradition of African music became the foundation for jazz, blues, rock, and virtually every form of popular music. But I think I've made my point, Traore concluded. The question isn't whether Africa contributed to civilization, Traore said. The question is why you, a professor at one of the world's most prestigious universities, don't know any of this. Or worse, he paused, making eye contact with Harrington, why you know it and choose to deny it. The first clap came from a young African woman in the third row, then another. Within seconds, the entire theater erupted in thunderous applause. Students stood, then professors, then even some of the administrators. But the most remarkable reaction came from an elderly white professor in the front row. Professor Mary Whitfield, head of African Studies, stood and spoke into her microphone. Mr. President, she said, acknowledging Traore's actual title for the first time, as a member of this institution, I apologize. Your words today have exposed a shameful blind spot in our curriculum. I move that Oxford immediately review and revise our history programs to include the African contributions you've outlined. The applause renewed, even louder. Harrington, isolated on the side of the stage, looked around desperately for support, but found none. His decades of authority had evaporated in 10 minutes. When the applause finally died down, Traore spoke once more. I don't seek apologies, he said quietly. I seek truth. And the truth is that human civilization is not the property of any one continent or race. It's the culmination of all human achievement, from the first mathematical calculation on an African bone to the latest scientific discovery. But as long as professors like Dr. Harrington continue to teach a deliberately incomplete history, we perpetuate ignorance and prejudice. Today, in this room, we have a choice: continue the lies, or embrace the full, rich, complex truth of human achievement.